Hello and welcome back to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Naweed Jabarkil. Today we're joined by Anne-Sophie Corbeau, Global Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy based at Columbia University in New York. Anne-Sophie is a world-renowned expert on trends in the gas industry, and we're very excited to hear your views. Welcome, Anne-Sophie.
Hello, Naweed. It's very nice to be with you today.
Great. So let's get started then. Maybe COP26 would be a good marker point to begin. What are your overall thoughts on the conference that we've just had, its outcomes, and how do you think the deal that was reached in the end will affect the global gas industry?
I think we are coming out of COP26 with probably more optimism, but also a sense that there is a lot to do. I mean, we have seen a certain number of commitments. For example, India committing to net zero by 2070, Russia and Saudi Arabia by 2060. There have been also a certain number of pledges. Some of them are going to impact directly the gas industry. So, for example, there has been the methane pledge, and we can talk about that later. There has been also an agreement to phase down, but not phase out coal, which is important for the coal and gas dynamics. And I guess, this kind of commitment has probably disappointed some people. Also, one comment which doesn't really affect the gas industry is a comment to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. This is very important. Something which was also quite unexpected was the agreement between China and the US to boost climate cooperation. I mean, given that the relationship between the two countries are relatively tense, I mean, I think that was a very welcome development. But in practice, I mean, there is a lot to do. So I think, to summarize, this COP26 was probably not as good as we had hoped, but probably not as bad as we feared. And now it's back to work for everybody because, these pledges, they need to be translated in practice into something concrete. And this is exactly the key problem now.
Yeah, and I think still a lot of disagreement, particularly among the nations themselves, almost 200 there, about how it's going to impact all of them and the timeframes that have been set. But let's look at gas, because arguably it's been perhaps the most volatile source of energy over the past few years. Explain why you think that is. Why has it been on this sort of roller coaster ride? I mean, it's your area of expertise, so I'm sure the audience would be fascinated to hear your analysis.
Yes, and I mean, prices are really at record levels. I mean, I was looking at the prices yesterday. We have reached 130 euro per megawatt hour, which is $42 per MMBTU in Europe. I think people need to get a sense on how high this is. This is like almost 5 times the kind of average prices that we have seen in Europe over the past 5 years. So this is really unexpected. And we have never, ever seen such prices on a sustained basis. I mean, we have been above $30 per MMBTU almost on average for the past 3 months. So this is not a blip. This is something which is staying with us and is probably going to stay with us for the winter. As to why we are in this situation, I think there are 6 main reasons. 5 of them are linked to fundamentals, and another one is more about geopolitics. So we have seen a very rapid economic recovery. That's the first reason. We have seen also unusual weather patterns which have increased the gas demand. So think about additional demand for heating because we had a very long winter in Europe. We had also extremely cold weather in Asia at the beginning of 2021. But we had also extremely hot summers, which have increased the demand for air conditioning. At the same time, we have also seen low hydro and low wind in some regions. I mean, Brazil, for example, is facing the worst drought in a century. So, of course, they need more LNG. And China is the same thing. They have problem with hydro. In Europe, we have seen less wind. So this is the third reason. The fourth reason is that we have seen a combination of high commodity prices, especially coal prices were really high, especially in October before China intervened. So coal prices were at $250 per ton. And you add to that the fact that carbon prices in Europe are also at record high. They reach about 90 euro per ton. So you have kind of a relationship between these 3 different prices, and they are all linked to each other. The fifth reason, which is also linked to the fundamentals, is that on the global LNG market, we have seen a lot of LNG supply issues. I mean, Norway, for example, the facility has been off. We have seen some problems in different countries, which were also linked to the fact that in 2020, we couldn't do the maintenance. and they have been postponed to 2021. And finally, the final reason, which is a mix of fundamental and geopolitics, is Russia. So the supplies of pipeline gas to Russia, they have not been as high as the market was expecting. And this is also happening in the context of, for Russia to try to get the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is linking directly Russia to Europe and especially to Germany, operational. Before we started this winter, people were expecting this pipeline to be operational. Now, between the certification issues, so the Bundesnetzagentur has said that they are going to stop they stopped actually the certification process because the entity which is going to operate Nord Stream 2 needs to be basically based in Germany, and this is basically postponing everything. And on top of that, this is happening in the context of Russian troops which are at the border of Ukraine. The US doesn't want this pipeline to be operational. There is also within Europe a lot of discussion about whether we need this pipeline or not, and this is basically what people are looking at. So right now, people are looking at two things: the weather and whether or not Russia is sending more gas through the usual and the historical and existing pipelines. These are the two things that people are looking at.
It's interesting. 5 of the 6 things you touched upon there were market related, but I can't remember an energy issue in recent times which has had such great political ramifications, whether it's in the US and President Biden or companies going under in Europe. Gas companies, for example, unable to supply gas. This is something that's affecting consumers all around the world. As the Northern Hemisphere winter approaches, perhaps another cold winter, do you think prices are set to get worse, the volatility set to get worse?
I mean, the volatility is just extraordinary. Just over the past 10 days, I mean, we have seen prices in Europe increasing by $10 per MMBTU. We were below 30 last week. Now, a few announcements about the certification and an announcement by the new German foreign minister. And here we are at above 42. And I was looking at the prices just during this morning, and we lost about $3 per MMBTU just within the few hours, so from 8 o'clock to 11 o'clock. So, I mean, this is really a sense of volatility that I have never, ever seen in the market. And as you say, indeed, I mean, this is impacting consumers. I wouldn't say all over the world. I mean, this is impacting Europe in particular because a lot of European prices is actually linked to these spot prices. Additionally, this is also impacting all the LNG importers which have been relying on spot LNG. So LNG cargoes which are linked to either TTF prices in Europe or JKM prices. So these are directly impacted. And what we can see already is that there is some demand destruction in Europe and there is also some demand destruction in Asia. In Southeast Asia, the demand for LNG has been much lower because, I mean, usually, these countries are saying, oh, this is too high at $10 per MMBTU. What do you think is happening at $30 or $40 per MMBTU?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And just on one of the other issues you touched upon there as the causal factors, you mentioned that market instability could be because of maintenance issues, storage issues, another thing that's received a lot of attention. Why have the main consumer markets not increased their storage capabilities in recent times, do you think?
So I think I want to make something very clear. Europe has a lot of storage capacity, underground storage capacity. The problem is that just ahead of the winter, some of these storage facilities were not full. Actually, they were pretty empty. And these storage facilities are the ones which have been operated by Gazprom. They are located in Europe, but they are operated by Gazprom. In Asia, however, they made sure that their storage facilities, and this is mostly LNG in Japan and Korea, they made sure that the storage facilities were as full as possible. We assume that the same thing happened also in China. China has some underground storage, but not enough underground storage if you look at the total size of the market and the fact that demand has increased a lot. So in China, there is a need for additional underground capacity because the market is growing very fast and also because a lot of this demand is actually residential demand. So demand which is going to be higher during winter.
And just to go back to methane, you said we'll talk about it later, but one thing I noticed at COP26 was the element of surprise when President Biden announced the the big plan on methane. Some people think it may be a quick but essential fix for climate change. How will it impact gas producers, do you think, and can they fix this emission problem more quickly?
I think the first thing about methane is that we need to really understand how much methane emissions there are. I mean, the problem is that methane is invisible and we have a data issue. So first thing is really to understand how much methane is emitted by whom. I mean, it's not only an oil and gas problem, there is also coal and there is also a lot of basically emissions which are coming from agricultural sector. So how much is really coming from the oil and gas and where is it located? So this is the first thing that we need to understand. There have been a lot of improvements with satellites. There have been also a lot of improvements. I mean, companies are really trying to understand better, at least some of them. But the methane pledge, which was announced in COP26, is really going in the right direction. However, you can notice that some countries have not signed it, like China, for example, Australia. So we really need, first of all, to have better data. So this is, I think, why the IMEO, the International Methane Emission Observatory, is essential. We need better data, we need better reporting, and we will also need regulation to make sure that we are actually decreasing the methane emission. But look at the prices now. If we reduce methane emission, that means that there is more gas to be sold. And I think, right now, when you are looking at the economics, well, it makes a lot of sense. So this is really in the interest of companies to understand where they have methane emissions, to try to prevent them, and to sell the gas accordingly. And also, I mean, from a reputational point of view, it's absolutely essential that the gas industry solves this methane problem.
Yeah, and I think a lot of producing nations are looking at that, and also the business opportunity, as you rightly mentioned. Let's just change tack then a bit as we're approaching near the halfway stage, and I want to talk about perhaps the elephant in the room at COP26, the dirty fuel, coal. It's still a major source of energy. Its production offering employment to millions around the world, even in some developed nations like Australia. What are your thoughts on how coal was approached? We saw that last minute fading down from India and China, which pushed for coal to be phased down rather than phased out. What's next for the industry, do you think, as we look to other cleaner sources of energy, and can it be saved by carbon capture and storage?
I think, this is a typical example of, what the Western world is looking at and what other countries are looking at. I mean, simple fact, 2/3 of today's coal consumption are in two countries, China and India. Now, you look at China, I mean, right now they are consuming coal, and a lot of coal, because they are facing power shortages. So, for them, also a very important coal producer. I mean, this is very important to continue to have electricity generation, and the simple source for them is coal. And let's not forget that, one of the reasons why we are having such a high electricity demand in China is also because we in Western countries, I mean, we want goods. I mean, we want the Christmas gifts, and a lot of them are going to come from China. So, I mean, let's be very clear about why also we are seeing these kind of problems. And in India, I mean, also India depends a lot on coal. We have seen very ambitious targets, for example, to have 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel capacity by 2030. But, this capacity is going to be first in order to meet additional electricity demand. And maybe it can reduce somehow the coal-fired generation, but it's not going to completely remove the coal-fired generation. This is first of all because India is growing and people need more electricity, and a lot of people do not have access to electricity. And also a very simple fact, I mean, coal right now is so much more profitable than burning gas at these high prices. So you talked about CCUS. Yes, CCUS could help coal. First of all, you need to develop the CCUS, but let's not forget one thing is that for every single kilowatt hour of coal-fired generation, you are going to emit twice as much CO2 as for gas.
Yeah, and let's touch upon gas, but I think the issue of legacy is quite important, particularly for countries like China as well, with more than half of the world's coal-fired plants there. It's not just simply going to be an issue of turning off the tap, so to speak. But you mentioned gas. What are your thoughts on the future of the gas industry? Because these rising prices, not bad news for everybody. Some producing nations like Qatar, for example, and others may be seeing this as an opportunity. But where do you see gas heading? Will it be a standby fuel, for example, in the future with this drive towards renewables? So when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow, gas can step in?
I think we need to be very realistic. I mean, for gas to have a future, and especially for gas demand to increase in the developing world, because we know that in developed countries like Europe, the US, Japan, I mean, gas consumption is going to come down because of energy efficiency, because of displacement by renewables. So the future for gas is in the developing world. And for that, natural gas has to be affordable. And I'm sorry to say that, I mean, the $30 per MMBTU or $40 per MMBTU, this is not great news. I mean, if you want to convince countries like India, like Philippines, like Vietnam to say yes to natural gas or to LNG, it needs to be affordable. It cannot be in $30 per MMBTU or even $15 per MMBTU range. I mean, it needs to be in the $6 to $8 per MMBTU range. And then the second thing, and we have already talked about that, is that you need to basically improve the green credentials of natural gas. So you need to tackle the methane emission problems, and you will also need to develop CCUS. This is absolutely fundamental, because if you only develop natural gas, but you do not care about the emissions, eventually by 2030, 2040, most of the emissions are going to come from natural gas. So gas has to be decarbonized, and natural gas has to be associated with CCUS. Now, I mean, whether this is going to be used for industrial purposes, whether it's going to be used for power generation, or maybe to produce hydrogen, I mean, we will see. But for these three applications, CCUS is going to be absolutely fundamental. And finally, on your point about gas providing the flexibility in the power generation sector, yes, this is very much true, and this remains true for the decade to come, or maybe decades to come. However, I mean, there will be other tools which are going to provide flexibility, like batteries, and maybe eventually hydrogen. So, the gas industry has to be also careful not to say, yeah, I mean, gas is the perfect solution. Yes, but there might be also other tools, and you have to think about, I mean, how are we going to finance a system where gas power plants are only going to be needed for a few hundreds of hours per year? I mean, in terms of the pipeline, in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of the import. So, you really need to think about the future.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And I think it brings us on perfectly to the final issue I wanted to touch upon, perhaps a more nascent part of the industry, looking at developing hydrogen. Maybe this might be a hard question to finish on, but what color do you think it will be in the future? It's something you have a research interest in. And you mentioned gas and its links to hydrogen. Can the future of gas be it being converted into hydrogen?
I was in the previous hydrogen wave. So I started my career 20 years ago with hydrogen and fuel cells. And I realized, well, okay, I'm way too early. So I basically waited 20 years, and look, now hydrogen is coming back. But let's be very clear. I mean, hydrogen markets right now, this is still in its infancy, right? And we should not really focus about green, blue, turquoise, or whatever the color. I mean, right now, the imperative is to develop a market for hydrogen. We need to reduce the cost. We need to develop the infrastructure. We need to basically make sure that this is a solution which is going to be adopted in the different sectors, so industrial hard-to-abate sectors, transport sectors, the shipping industry, maybe power generation, heating. So this is a problem now. We need to develop hydrogen, whatever the color and whatever the project. And for gas, indeed, I mean, hydrogen is likely to be a key source of demand, and the problem again is that what are we going to do with the carbon? Because if you are talking about the blue hydrogen, where we are reforming natural gas and we are basically storing the CO2, so you need to develop the CO2. Or if we are looking at the so-called turquoise hydrogen, which is pyrolysis, and you get carbon black. But do not forget something is that for every kilogram of hydrogen, you are going to get 2.5 kilograms of carbon black. So very soon we are going to have more carbon black than the current market if we are developing pyrolysis at scale. So you need to do something about that carbon black as well. So to summarize, I think there is a lot to do before we even develop, a market for hydrogen, but that could be a good opportunity for natural gas if and only if CCUS is developed as well at scale.
Yeah, coming back to that same issue again, it's fascinating stuff. If you do think of any other good business ideas you're working on now, do let us know, because it would be a shame to talk in 20 years' time and realize we've missed out on another one. But Anne-Sophie, that question, probably we'll leave it there, running out of time. But thank you so much on behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation for joining me and providing us with your expert analysis. I'm sure many of our listeners would be appreciating what they've just heard. The Foundation very much looks forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
And listeners, thank you very much for your time. Be sure to keep up to date with all of the Al-Attiyah Foundation's work by following us on Twitter and on YouTube. Thank you and goodbye.